everyone. It's great to see everyone in person. Yay! I know we have a Zoom audience as well. I don't know how many is on there, but I'm sure it's like hundreds. So welcome to the Zoom audience as well. I'd first like to thank SGS for organizing this symposium, and Kristen especially for all our hard work in putting this together.
Kristen!
And to our keynote speaker today, who are your wonderful So SPICE is the education outreach arm of the Freedom Symposium Institute, and SPICE is always, it's such a delight for us to collaborate with SGS on the EPIC project. We've been doing this for many years now, and it's something that Gary and I always look forward to. Gary and I are so grateful to get to have the opportunity to work with a group of the fellows each year. This year it's Lauren, Alexandria, Tomas, and Meloni. And we're always just so impressed by their work, and we learn so much from them, and it's such an inspiration to be together with them. And so they're going to give their presentations today. We've set it up so that we have two presentations, and then we have Q&A, and then we have two more presentations after that. So we're going to start with our first two presenters are Lauren Blanchard, our political science instructor from Monterey Peninsula College, and she'll be talking politics of migration and citizenship. And then it'll be Alexandria White, who's English professor at Sacramento City College, and her presentation is Black Authentic Exploration. So I will now hand it over to Lauren.
Thank you so much. Do I have a control?
Is there a clicker in the house?
You can go to the podium too. Because I was planning on going to the podium.
Nope. Is this it? Yes. Yep.
Thank you. Just forward, I guess, right? I guess. Forward. All right. Okay, well, I can go over there.
Oh, there.
All right, there we go. Patience. The clicker is teaching me patience. All right, so thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here. My name is Lauren Blanchard, and I teach political science and global studies at Monterey Peninsula College, which is on the central coast of California. Right, Monterey is a town many people are familiar with. There we go. As a brief overview, right, my EPIC project included the creation of a class called Politics of Migration and Citizenship to be taught at Monterey Peninsula College, and it was approved by our curriculum advisory committee. So in that sense, it is a successful project. It will be offered. It's on the calendar for spring 2023. I think the claps from my fellow community college instructors were particularly loud because you are aware of how difficult it can be to create a new class at a community college. So, just that alone felt like a real victory. There is a long rollout for classes at community colleges. We often have to create them a year, or even 2 years before they're going to be eligible to be scheduled. And that provides me with a real opportunity in the next year or so to really drum up interest in this class, advertise its existence, but also advertise what is unique about this class, which is that I'm going to be working with our internship office to provide students with the opportunity to engage in active learning through a 1 credit or 2 credit, if they're interested, internship that would go alongside of this class. And so I get to collaborate with a program that we're rolling out called the Career Academy, right, which will provide students with some guidance before their internship. So during the fall semester, some students will be able to get kind of fundamental guidance about how to engage in the workplace, but then also will be able to be paid for their internships, even if the employers don't have resources to do them. And that's a really nice bonus that I didn't anticipate when I started this program, but will make that internship opportunity a real possibility for some of my students that it wouldn't be if it wasn't paid. So because it's been approved, it is now one of only 3 courses at Monterey Peninsula College that specifically address migration. And that's notable because in Monterey County, we have a very large percentage of the population that's born outside the United States. It is a particular center for migration, both because of the agriculture industry, which draws in people, but also because of institutions like the Defense Language Institute, which is in Monterey, and the Institute for International Studies, which is also in Monterey. My initial motive was to try to increase the number of classes that were dealing with it. You know, I would have students on the regular sharing experiences, sharing long-term goals that seemed to me to have this really clear link to migration. So because I teach in political science, many of my students want to grow up to be lawyers, and they often imagine that they're going to get to do the most exciting forms of law. And when I had taught in other places, that was oftentimes civil rights law or human rights law or international law. But in Monterey, for many of my students, it's immigration law, right? They are interested in understanding the system better. They are interested in engaging in active change around it. And so I try, all right, when thinking about new classes, because they are such a heavy lift at the community college system, I try to really make sure that I keep my students at the forefront. But the other thing that I particularly like to do when I'm thinking about how to structure classes, or when I'm thinking particularly about new curriculum, is I like to start by thinking about, right, the kind of learning that happens outside of the classroom. I often start my political science classes by telling my students that they are already experts in politics, right? They have to navigate familial politics, right? Who do you ask for money? Who do you ask for a ride? They have to navigate workplace politics, right? They have to navigate a whole set of different political scenarios, and they understand power before they walk in my classroom. But some of the more specific topics, I try to engage in a little thought. How is it that someone learns about migration, right, if they're not taking a class called The Politics of Migration and Citizenship? I don't know if anybody has any really clear memory of early lessons about migration. I would imagine some people probably do have really clear memories about how they learned about migration. I have a really clear memory about how I learned about migration, and that's because of kind of a little peculiarity of my family history. This is what I always imagined I would do when I presented at Stanford, is put up a picture of myself as a child. No. So this is Lauren Handley at 5 years old, and a little excerpt from a journal of one of my direct ancestors. And, you know, one of the reasons I start by thinking about how I learned about a topic, and I'm trying to get information about how my students will learn about a topic before they arrive in the classroom, is because I want to be attentive to my own short-sightedness and my own preconceived notions, my own set of assumptions about what maybe needs to be learned about a topic. So my family participated in the Mormon migration. And so this journal entry, right, very in great detail describes that process, right? The distance traveled, the place left, the value of the farm that was sold in order to generate it, how many horses and carts. It's a huge privilege to have this kind of detailed information about your family's migration story. And I grew up in a community that really valued that story. I created a holiday around that story. It's Pioneer Day. And here I am playing one of my favorite games from when I was a child, which is Pioneer, which is deeply embarrassing. But also, right, just the reality of how I learned about migration. I learned about it in a way that valued it, but also stripped away any of the kind of problematic aspects about my family's engagement in westward migration, and, you know, set me up, right, in a way where I think the way that I learned about it really set me up in a way where I might be predisposed to contrast this, right, story which I had been told was valuable migration against other stories, maybe that are described as less valuable. So in thinking about how I wanted to structure this class, one of the questions I was asked by my curriculum advisory committee was, why not a class about immigration? Right? Why not focus it on immigration? There are maybe more classes at higher levels that focus on immigration policy, and I really wanted not to do that. Right? I wanted to create a course that would provide my students with new information and avoid reinforcing some of the stereotypes. And I think that the stereotype that it is, you know, kind of most easily reinforced in a class on migration would be the kind of nation of immigrants mythology that the United States has about itself, which is a story that's really deeply Eurocentric. It puts the United States at the center of migration stories worldwide in a way that doesn't reflect reality. And so things like the condition of leaving a place during migration gets wiped away with the nation of immigrants mythology, the forced migrations that have been a kind of component of our national history, and then also, right, the internal migrations, which would have been how I had been trained to think about my own family's activities. It wasn't actually an internal migration, it was an international migration. But again, that was not part of the story that I was taught. And I also wanted to avoid naturalizing the state, right? In my other international politics classes, I work really hard to denaturalize the state, and so I didn't want to undo any of that work. And I wanted to avoid prioritizing borders over the kind of people, right, that are at the center of the migration stories that I want my students to be exposed to. I wanted to avoid telling half the story as well. You know, oftentimes internal migration gets left out of the story that we tell about how people move around the world in 2022, as though it isn't a significant effort to move a great distance within a country. It can be. I wanted to avoid, right, reinforcing any media narratives, right, and to avoid kind of excluding, in particular, Black communities and Indigenous American communities. I also wanted to give my students an opportunity to learn this actively, right? Because although I have thought a great deal about the texts I will be using, right, that may not be the most effective way for my students to learn things, particularly because of the district I teach in, which is a deeply segregated district, right? The district that I teach in includes Big Sur and Carmel and Pebble Beach, which are not necessarily the places where our students are coming to us from. About 43% of our students prior to the pandemic were traveling in from the Salinas Valley. And so I wanted to create an opportunity for my students to learn actively, but maybe also facilitate my students' movement across the boundaries in our own community, right? Boundaries that are related to residential segregation very clearly, right? That becomes really obvious when you have a private town in the middle of your community college district, but also, right, kind of explicitly economic and overtly racist segregation too. The internship, right, will be structured around a 50 hours of internship equals 1 unit. And so students can do more than that, but that's the kind of, right, that's the baseline amount. And what we'll do is collaborate with the Cooperative Work Experience Program to bring in internship coordinators during the first week so that students will know about the opportunity. They will be able to plan for the opportunity if it's something that they can plan for. And then also in week 6, right? And then they will experience an internship with the benefit, right, of me as their political science teacher, a business teacher as their, right, internship instructor, and then also an employer. So it will be a kind of big team of people built around our interns. In terms of outcomes, I'm hoping that students will develop the ability to use particularly political science scholarship, and I'll get to that in the very end, to explain migration patterns. I want them to begin to critically assess all of the kind of fire hose of information in the United States that gets thrown at people about immigration and migration, to consider the ways in which our ideas about culture and identity really shape our understandings about migration. And then, there are also some interesting methodological questions, right? How do you track something that people don't want to be tracked in some cases? And that's something that's interesting too. There are so many potential case studies that I can use to give really concrete context to the kind of broader texts that I'm going to be using, and in ways that really complicate our understandings of migration, right? Decentering the United States, and really thinking about the way in which states oftentimes use migration as a way of structuring citizenship, which is why I included citizenship in the title of the course. There are so many, right, excellent texts about migration. I had an additional requirement, which is that I wanted them to be open access. And so these are examples of some of the texts that my students will be reading. I also want to give my students the opportunities for low stakes reading. And so, for instance, UNESCO very conveniently just had an issue of their journal dedicated to stories of migration, right? That is a little bit kind of lower intensity reading, not theoretical, but instead really kind of humanizing stories. And so that's something that I intend to use as well. The goal, right, by doing that, I'm keeping textbook costs for the course at 0, right? I want this course to be a net benefit to my students, not a disadvantage. And then finally, I'm just gonna give a little pitch. I don't get opportunities to talk to a whole bunch of community college instructors all that often. So this course had initially been intended to be both a politics and a global studies course. But because of the rigidity of the global studies transfer model curriculum, which is used at the community colleges to structure programs so that they are transferable to CSUs, it can't be, right? A course called Politics of Migration and Citizenship is not eligible to be listed as a global studies requirement. And there are really 2 kind of opportunities, right, to change that. One of which is to wait as migration courses become more common at CSUs, because at some point, right, this will likely be a topic that I can address in the global studies curriculum. But the other possibility is to advocate for change during the 5-year cycle in which we get to provide commentary about global studies curriculum. And so I'm gonna end with thanks, but really my kind of final component of my presentation is a pitch. Hey guys, don't you think that maybe we should work on making the global studies curriculum more available for local choice so that the courses that are included in the program can really suit the specific needs of specific regions in California? That's something that is profoundly doable, right? Because my sense is that a few very committed faculty could make a big difference at one of those curriculum meetings. I want to end by thanking you all for coming. I'm really so grateful to my fellows. I learned so much, and I'm really thankful to my touchstones during this process, who are Kristen, Jonas, and Gary.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Remember to hold your questions, and then after our next speaker, we'll open it up for question time for Q&A. So next speaker is Alexandria White.
Hi, everybody. My presentation is called Black Atlantic Explorations And I adapted this theme for my critical thinking class. I teach English. I teach with a learning community called Umoja, which is a learning community that targets African American students. I also teach in the Literature and Language Arts department, and I teach regular students as well. But I decided to adapt my research, my epic fellowship project for my critical thinking class. So we studied, we explored Haitian history. Specifically, we looked at the Haitian Revolution, and looked at the Haitian Revolution in relationship to the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and really did a close historical analysis or telescoping of the conditions that allowed for Haiti to overthrow slavery and colonialism. And it's such a powerful historical moment that's often overlooked, right? So we looked at that, and then we also looked at African Brazilian literature, and so we looked at African Brazilian literature and culture. I also hosted an incredible African American and African diaspora dance scholar as a part of my desire to not just teach things from textbooks and historical things, and I wanted to teach students, have them access this beautiful Black diasporic culture. So I had an incredible scholar, UC Davis emeritus, lead a workshop through Zoom on the history of the diasporic dance, and the importance of developing diasporic literacy, which I'll talk more about later. I also partnered with the Global Studies program on my department, and they created this 3-day-long virtual Global Futures event, just jam-packed with great speakers from all over the world, really. And I was asked to facilitate a discussion with an African Brazilian climate justice academic. So I was able to facilitate that discussion, and I invited students to participate in that as well. And I was supposed to host a band, African Brazilian band, for Earth Day. We were trying to create like a welcoming kind of in-person event on our campus. We're still mostly closed down. And of course, the one day that we had set up for this band to come, it rained, so we weren't able to host them. But it did initiate a conversation with administration about having them come back for the fall, as we open up for fall 2022. So we covered a broad history of these two countries and examined some of their cultural practices. So I had some guiding questions throughout this course. So I tried to adapt my fellowship proposal for my class, for my critical thinking Comp 2 class. And these are some of the questions that I used to guide the course. And I have a couple of reflection questions sprinkled throughout this presentation. We might be able to come back to them later. But I really wanted to try to give my students and try to invite them to be curious and open about the world outside of Sacramento. So I really feel like I was just trying to plant seeds, because I know when I discovered these things in college, when I learned about how other New World Black Atlantic cultures developed, I was very, very curious about that. As an African American, just very curious. And I wanted to invite my students to be curious about these things. These contexts are so different. Although we have so much in common with Haitians and with African Brazilians, their specific contexts are very unique. So I had to do a lot of background for them, right? And we did covered a lot of history. But I feel like it was a powerful experience for me to be able to do this with the students, and then for their eyes, you could just see their eyes opening up, and then they were just really, I think, more curious Why does this matter? Lauren just gave an incredible presentation about migration, politics of migration, and she talked about the story, the importance of the stories around migration. For Black people in this country, we don't have a positive association with our story of being here. And through my life as a student, as an academic, as a world citizen, I've always been proud of the story, even with all the tragedy that surrounds it. And some of that came from when I traveled to study abroad and was able to encounter how people view Black history from other places, and how much pride and power that people saw Black history through. I was like, wow, okay, this is, yes, we're important, right? What we have done is important. Of course, the origin of Black people in this country, for the most part, starts with forced migration. But if you do a deep dive, you realize that Africans came over with the Spanish conquistadors, right? Some people say that Africans were here first. African indigenous groups were here alongside other indigenous groups. So there's a lot of history that needs to be reimagined and rediscovered. But for the most part, most of us were brought to the New World through the transatlantic slave trade. And I use this map and maps similar to this with my students often, because if you look at the numbers, the amount of Africans that were taken to the New World, to North America, is very slim, right? And slavery was really only allowed, below the Mason-Dixon line. It was controlled, very small amount of people. But you look at Brazil, it's incredible, right? Just how many Black people were taken there. And I joked around with my students. I'm like, we should be Brazilian. Like, why are we North America? Like, how did we end up here? It's very special that we're here in North America. But I really wanted to expand my students' sense of belonging in the world. I wanted them to have a bigger, feel more connected to Black heritage beyond just being in Sacramento and being in California. Because we really are, I claim all this as part of my heritage. I claim all of it, and I feel like it's very, it's empowering for me. So the transatlantic slave trade started with forced migration, Ma'afa. A lot of African people, we talk about this as the African Holocaust. So there's a lot of tragedy, a lot of pain. Whole industries were created to facilitate the process of slavery. Our modern society as we know it was established through this forced migration. The modern political hegemony, global hierarchy is established through this, right? Paul Gilroy was one of the first people to coin this term, the Black Atlantic, and he was looking at how it's through this exchange and movement of people, of Black people moving from Europe, going to the United States, from Africa, Caribbean. This exchange has created a new Black identity. And it's not only tied to tragedy, but tied to new identities. He reminds us that the process of movement and exchange led to innovative, powerful, creative Black cultural and aesthetical possibilities and realities, new musical genres, new dance forms, and new political frameworks as well. Saidiya Hartman reminds us through her Atlantic explorations. She's focused on Ghana specifically, and my project looks at the New World Atlantic experience, the New World Black Atlantic experience. But she talks a lot about, in her book, she's talking about the experience of going back to Ghana and trying to relive those final moments that Africans experienced before they were put on ships. She reminds us that we have to, we still need to actively restore value, dignity, humanity to Black lives due to the perverse racial logic that was established through the transatlantic slave trade. We're still divorcing Blackness, with being lesser than, right? Thank you. So now, we have Nicole Hannah-Jones, who says that we need to create a new origin story for the United States, but I would say we need a new origin story for the New World in period. And I would say that the transatlantic slave trade, the forced migration of Africans has changed, would not be possible. The world that we live in today would not be possible had not this forced migration happened. So some of the text I use for Haiti is C.L.R. James, and I basically used his Black Jacobins text. We looked at a couple of first chapters of his book, and he was writing in the 30s, writing from the bottom up, writing from the bottom of like the academic social hierarchy up to speaking back to the power, right, and saying that actually the Haitians, what they were able to do was incredible, right? What they were able to do was incredible, and they were inspired by the French Revolution, by the American Revolution, and had Napoleon not lost Haiti, United States would have never gained Louisiana Purchase, which doubled our landmass, right? And students most of us just aren't aware of these things. So for Brazil, I focused on this figure, Abdias do Nascimento, and he's like the grandfather of the Black movement in Brazil, like the civil rights movement that sort of correlates to our civil rights movement here. And we looked at his play, Sortilège, and it's a really allegorical play. It's written in the 50s, was meant to challenge European standards of beauty, aesthetical values. And through this play, we were able to look more at African spiritual practice of candomblé, and there's dance in this in the play, and there's ritual, and students were very curious about these African gods, these gods that were brought to the New World with the African slaves that we often don't learn about as North Americans. So I think the highlight of this course was hosting Dr. Halifa Osamare. She's just a powerhouse. She's the one that reminded me and said, reminded us that at the workshop that, most of the dance moves that we do in the club, right, are coming from Africa. The isolations, the gyrations, the hip shaking, the footwork, right? Like I know some of you guys were listening to electronica music back in the day, and I know some of you guys probably have some pretty cool dance moves, right? But the footwork, the dance, the gyrations, the isolations, that's all coming from Africa. And I really loved hosting her because she reminded us that there's an African orientation towards the world that's very unique. And that those of us in the diaspora, we value action. We know that wisdom and knowledge lives in the body. And that in order to engage with Black students, we have to do more than just teach them out of a textbook. We have to actually get them moving around, get them doing something, using their bodies. So I know that I'm pretty sure I'm done. They're giving me the 1 minute cue here. The last thing that I really enjoyed was facilitating this talk with this incredible Brazilian woman from Rio de Janeiro. You don't really see a lot of Black Brazilian women academics out in the world. So I got to connect with her outside of campus as well. And I'll end here by saying, I got to actually connect more with these scholars and to go deeper into their work. And I have so much more I want to do with this project. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. So this epic project allowed me to make epic connections, and I just want to thank everybody. Thanks you guys for being here.
You will, of course, have an opportunity to talk more with them and ask questions during lunch and throughout the symposium. So thank you so much. I'm going to move on to our next two presenters. So we have Tomas Stanek, who is Associate Professor of History at Victor Valley College, and he'll be talking about Global Ethnic Studies course proposal. And then we'll have Meloni Gandhi, who is part-time faculty, Global Studies and Workforce at Foothill College, and she'll be talking about virtual study abroad. So, Tomas.
Hello, everyone. It is extremely stressful to be sat here in front of you in this upper elevation. Typically, I'm very animated in front of my classroom. I would rather do that speech on the steps of the building rather than inside. All right, my project, or the goal of the project, was to create a global ethnic history course. We all know about the recent push in community colleges towards ethnic studies curriculum that was enacted even by the state bill. So my project sort of tackles that idea in the area of history. And I was told by my dean that maybe perhaps my course might work out in the fall or might not. So it's just a matter of transfer credits and other administrative issues. Now, some of you looking at the slide probably thinking like, why is there a man sitting on a rock and why is it important? The whole course is built around themes, and those themes represent of what I have read recently in the past year and a half. The picture here, the image, is taken by a photographer from The Guardian, the British newspaper, from the island of Banaba, or Ocean Island, and presents a man sitting on a pinnacle of a rock, or what used to be a superphosphate. The whole idea of the island, as you may see, actually looks pretty green, but the island is essentially denuded and destroyed. And why this slide? Let me move on. Now, here's where the island is located. Banaba is right on the equator, south of the Marshall Islands, north of Solomon Islands, essentially north of Australia, New Zealand. So essentially a planet away from us. In the early 19th century, the area, along with the island of Nauru, has been found to have tremendous amount of superphosphates, which are used as fertilizer. Some of you might know guano from a coastal Peru that has been used by Europeans throughout 19th century until, or even early 20th century, until essentially superphosphates were found in the Pacific, and eventually the artificial way of making fertilizer has been introduced. So what does it mean, and why is it important for the course? Environmental degradation, as you look at the island now, this is a bird's eye view, shows exactly that. Once island in a height of about 95 meters has been reduced to about 60 meters at its highest points, with a lot more phosphate being essentially excavated and mined by the British and Australian companies till about 1970s. Now, what happened to the people? Well, people were removed. All of them ended up in Fiji and off the islands of Fiji through forced migrations. Currently, if you look up Banaba, there's about 300 or 400 inhabitants who are still sticking out to the life on the island, which had been essentially consumed. And the course pretty much essentially produces that very comparative idea of consumption of the indigenous ideas of the rest of the world by the first world. And one of the things that I kind of really liked in that story of Banaba, which was told by Ekaterina Taiwa, who published the book, was the fact that the ashes of the islands have been spread all throughout the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, through planes as fertilizer. And that kind of brings me back to the idea of a Holocaust and other things in Europe, which have that sort of comparative analysis and ring the bell once you read more about the literature. So the course kind of represents those kind of stories and these kind of ideas. So what are the course characteristics? The course proposal explores cultural borderlands of selected geographies, shared global experience of forced migrations, genocide, and colonialism, not exclusively, but among other issues. It could be easily crossed as a history, sociology, global ethnic studies, or cultural anthropology course. So this is my way of pleading the case to my dean to see where we can explore the deficiencies in the curriculum offer. It is also interdisciplinary in content. So in other words, issues that I'm tackling are not only climatology, history, geography, sociology, but also environmental studies. We have missing content. The 4 items that are included in the course here that were listed were PISA characteristics. In other words, what does it make for the course to be global? Meaning, how do you explore global geographies? How do you present global themes? How is that theme consumed by the students? And at what level do you introduce these ideas? Of course, course is very introductory and also uses international examples. For instance, here, the image that is still prevailing is the Cyrillic alphabet. When we get to the ideas of ethno-nationalism and ethnic issues in Russia, one of the biggest countries in the world, I typically run the exercise of the Russian language with the students, which I found very comical, but yet at the same time, very learning experience. Some of the books and material that is used is very novel, very contradicting, very new. Most of those publications that you see in front of you come from anywhere between 2009 and 2019. The book, the first position that I've introduced in Power Slide, the Ocean Island, Consuming Ocean Island, that sort of drives the idea of consumption around the world. The second book, maybe some of you are familiar with, The Sea is My Country, which explores indigenous issues in our country, in the Pacific, Greater Pacific, and sort of juxtaposes the idea of ownership and benefit. One of the very puzzling to students' idea is the fact that Western society places extreme value on land. In which when the British explorers or European Anglo-American explorers came to the Pacific Northwest, they were extremely interested in counting land acres, right? That to them was valuable. Not knowing that the indigenous cultures within the Pacific, Maka culture, actually valued seascapes rather than landscapes as more important. So you can kind of imagine how the discussion or incommensurability of commonality, even in the basic negotiations between one group and the other, became so incredible. So students are kind of going through those issues that are put in perspective not only from the Eurocentric tradition in which land, but also from the indigenous perspective. Negotiated Settlements by Wernke, also book published, I think in 2014, if I'm correct, approaches colonialism or settler colonialism in Latin America, and tries to rebuild the reality on the ground before Spanish arrival. And one of the novel ideas here used is GIS, essentially satellite data, that is for the first time used in writing history or rewriting the history or reconnecting to pre-colonial times. As British counted acres and created excellent land deeds, and many of them in libraries, the Spanish Empire counted heads and produced many censuses. So what has happened to the communities prior to arrival of Spanish and that sort of a terraforming or human forming? This is a very extreme example of the book that uses not only modern technology, satellite data, and reconstruct the idea of reducciones, which in Spanish language meaning to bring the people from the land back to the center so we can surveil, so we can have control over the indigenous minds, and of course recreating completely different topography of the cities and what's important, streets, et cetera, et cetera. And the last book here that I'm using also as an example of how the course is running and how themes are running is Doris Bergen, Holocaust, War and Genocide, which she pretty much introduces not the idea of how to commit one, but the topography and ontology of what has happened from the very beginning to the very end. Other textbooks that you might be, or textbook publications, recent publications that you might be familiar with are those presented, 1491, I think by Charles Mann, if you teach history, or if you have very popular text that builds upon others like Petroleum by Rudiman, and climatology, and how climatology affected not only colonization, settler colonization, but also sustainability of it, and the climate, the tempo of it, and why certain things happen in this part of the world sooner than in the Pacific, for instance, right? Did not happen until late 18th century. A professor from local here from Stanford, Norman Neymark, also wrote a genocide, from which I'm choosing certain chapters on a Rwandan genocide and also on communist ideology-based genocides in the 20th century. And when we're talking about settler colonialism, it's not only Anglo-American story, but it's also Japanese on Korean. It is also settler colonialism done by the Comanche Empire, the big dark hole in our history that many people don't realize, in which they carved themselves a great empire to even enslave white Anglo-Americans and Spanish colonial peoples. Other textbook that I'm using in my course is Thinking Globally, which is a sort of a shadow, very encyclopedic, pace as you go a book that introduces students, because this is an introductory course and I'm trying to create a very novel ideas and put them in a great contrast. However, I still keep it very basic, with basic ideas coming from this very model. So the course is designed into 8 modules, and lately I've noticed that all my college that I teach in, the tendency is to reduce courses to 8 consumable modules. It could be easily scalable to 16 or full term. Each module has a weekly discussion, and this is a Canvas version of it. Weekly quizzes, which run about 15 to 20 questions based on the literature that I just presented. The students are given not the whole book, chapters, specific reading to kind of consume before showing up for class, and then as part of a lecture, they will do the quiz. Also, throughout the course, we do have response papers to certain deeper issues, and of course, a research paper at the very end. Methodology, I use maps extensively in the class. Each lecture does begin with geopolitics and centering the area in a global topography. I use GeoAlliance Arizona State University maps, which come blank or filled, which is an excellent resource for you if you ever want to use them. They're PDF downloadable, so you can do all kinds of quizzes. Here is an example of me inserting B's, C's, and A's on a quiz on Latin America or South America. Some of the discussion questions that I want to present here, for instance, a question after reading Joshua Reed's The Sea is My Country: how were the seascapes and landscapes viewed by the Europeans? Something that I mentioned earlier. And then there's the discussion that definitely puts aside those who have read deeply and know versus those who did not. My research paper is based on very short characteristic of 5 to 7 pages, 10 authored sources. I do not allow editors. It has to be an author as a source. Typical lecture when it comes to a in-class live performance, introduction of a text, introduction of maps, and introduction of people, stories, or conflict. And of course, discussion afterwards based on given format. Here in this example, how are the indigenous Macas portrayed in the book, how does Reed's work challenge the traditional narrative of Native Americans? So this is sort of a counter narrative to that passivity, savagery. You pretty much go with the idea. And here's the modules. I want to give you short characterizations of modules and the books that I'm using in a greater curriculum. So module 1 tackles the issues of early modern globalization, borderlands, and cultural crossroads. So the borderlands between empires, the borderlands between people. Here are the books. You might be familiar with Zen. I throw it in. Chapter 1 on Columbus is very touchy, and I think people like it. As much as it is written on Zen from the other side, I think he still is influential and still stamping in community colleges. Module 2, Settler Colonialism, a Global Perspective. I'm using books to present Japanese settler colonialism, Comanche colonialism, the Spanish colonialism. Module 3 and 4 deals with genocide and issues of genocide. This is a big chapter, so I do have 2 modules. One deals with exclusively Holocaust and what has happened in the 20th century. That's sort of a consumption of a race. And the second module would deal with issues in the broader world, Rwanda, China, South Africa, West Africa, that sort of creation of that ontology of what has happened in the 20th century. Module 5, global ethnic conflicts in light of climate and ecological perspectives. So here's an excellent book by Duke, Terror Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossessions in China. I have a book on Broken Canopy. It's more of a report, which kind of creates a paradox. We're all peace-loving people in Colombia. The latest developments in which brought a long-awaited peace between FARC fighters and Colombian government brought unforeseen consequences for the rainforest and migrations of indigenous people, in which the fighting stopped. That meant that timber companies could move in. So these are the kind of issues that we're presenting. Another one is identity crisis and conflict in Myanmar, which are both driven by climate and ethnic tensions, and ethnic conflict and protests in Tibet, something that has been maybe perhaps forgotten since 2008 or early 2000s, kind of resurfaces now again in China. Module 6, Climate Refugees, a great book by Vannerston, which kind of divides the world into sections, and depending on the time that I have, whether I have a 1 module or 2 modules, or whether they can be expanded, we can go through African continent, we can go through Micronesia, we can go through South America and so forth. So it's a broad array of topics. Module 7, ethnic identities, belonging, and brotherly war. This kind of brings us to Ukraine conflict. When I started this program, the war did not start, right? So the selection that I've read and selected was from 2020, and of course that changes the whole perspective now for students who are discussing those issues. And here's the ideas of ethnic nationalism in Russia and how it changed from the empire to USSR and back to Russian Federation, and how ethnicity plays a role not only on policy but also driving ethnic conflict and ethnic pride, which brings us to the Ukraine conflict and great narrative. And Module 8, megacities and migrations. I have a couple of selections here. One, Balikbayan, Manila, migrations of people who have emigrated from Philippines and then immigrated back, bringing all the money and all the issues. And of course, we do have Bombay brokers, role of women in creating megacities, and role of construction workers. So sort of a grassroots step to look at the growth of tremendous cities in Asia. And of course, we do have, I'm using a lot of material from Statista, which is a great statistical tool located here in Stanford libraries, in which the PowerPoints and also PDFs are created on cities, on ethnic belonging, ethnic conflicts, and mapping those conflicts. A really great tool that community college students will enjoy. Now, thank you. I know I'm running into the time. The map here presents all the ethnic conflicts around the world in the 2020-22, and you can see the United States and Europe really positioned. So when you listen to the narratives from us, about us, you're not going to hear that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomas. And we'll hold our questions until our next speaker is done. So I'll hand it over to you, Iloni.
All right. So I am going to tell you a little bit more about virtual study abroad, and I'm really happy to be going after Tomas so we can continue a little bit of our Pacific exploration. And the way I like to think of virtual study abroad is, while it might not be actually being someplace, it's often the next best thing for folks who don't have those opportunities. So community college students don't often study abroad for a number of reasons: time, money, the opportunity cost. Our students often have a lot of other responsibilities, And they're very unlike a typical four-year student who could easily be gone for a semester or a year. And a couple of interesting data points to think about if you want to learn more about virtual study abroad, or study abroad in general for a start, is that the number at the bottom here in 2008, which was the last super comprehensive report on study abroad in community colleges. If you think about the number of community colleges in the United States, only just over 6,000 of them had an ability to participate in a physical study abroad program. And even if we go to the last pre-pandemic year, that number only jumped by 1,000, even though at that point, airfares were getting cheaper, it was easier to be mobile. It's still a big lack of opportunity. So another interesting place, if you're curious to learn more, is the Open Doors data that is pulled by the Institute of International Education. And I'm going to focus on showing you how most of the trends in community college study abroad mirror those of the 4 years, but at a much smaller level. But when you look at Oceania, it's drastically different. So only 7% of all programs at 4 years were in Oceania, but at a community college, it's 0.3, which is really, really sad in my opinion, because the Pacific offers so many rich cultural histories, but many of our preconceived ideas of what island life is like is just kind of like a vacation. But it's not. Everyone has an important history that should be shared and cultural identity that could be explored. And my goal was to try to find places that students wouldn't normally be able to access on their own, or find stories that they wouldn't be able to access on their own, and incorporate it into coursework. And the back photo, if you're curious, it's the Hindu temple in Nadi. And so if you don't have time and money, what's your next best option? And it's not just time and money, right? I also want to put out there again, the physical ability to travel. So if you have mobility issues, if you have other reasons why you cannot experience something like you can't climb steps anymore, for example, how could you still have the experience of being in those places? The other question is authenticity. So if you're thinking about designing a virtual study abroad curriculum piece into either your course as a module or building a whole course out of it, like how do you, how are you going to make it authentic? And so for me, what I try to do, because I did have the luxury of time and money for a little while, I decided that I wasn't going to share something with my students unless I actually experienced it for myself, so that there was only going to be one layer of translation between what the experience was that I had, that someone wanted me to have and know, and how I was then passing it on to my students. Thank you. And the other piece of it is you're kind of reimagining the idea of resources. And some of my colleagues already talked about, instead of like traditional textbooks, what else could become a resource, and how are you going to be able to build that in a way that's accessible to all your courses. In this past couple of years, many of us who may have been used to teaching in person had to build that into our thinking as we all moved online, but also in this particular idea, you have to be able to make sure that whatever you're putting in is going to be accessible to everyone. You'll see what I mean in the next couple of slides. So just kind of a little bit of how we're going to go through today. In my opinion, it is harder to build a truly multi-sensory virtual study abroad, but I think the impact for students who don't have the ability to experience firsthand is much greater. I like to build the syllabus out to say that when I'm trying to encourage students to have these experiences and still think along those lines of traveling, you're packing when you are getting all the different parts of the resource list that might be unusual to you, you're packing your bag. And then as we move through the course and you experience different sights and sounds and tastes and smells, at the end of it, we're gonna unpack everything to make sure you're not just having an isolated situation where you're like, oh, I ate a thing, it was cool. Well, let's look at like the history of what you ate and how it came to the place that it's represented and the story that that item is bringing to everyone that it's representing. So curating experience, right now what you're looking at is the Seychelles. And again, prime destination for vacationers, but it actually has a really rich history of immigration and migration and a blend of cultures that I personally haven't seen in other places, where the identity of being Seychellois overtakes any ethnic identity that you might have independently, versus many other countries that are ethnically diverse. Your cultural identity still takes place over your national identity. So I'm Asian American, I'm not just American, but if I was Seychellois, I would just be Seychellois. I wouldn't be an Indian Seychellois, which I thought was super interesting. But those are the kinds of experiences that I'm curating that people wouldn't necessarily seek on their own if they didn't have kind of a tour guide. It's kind of what I'm thinking of myself as when I'm building this out for my students. So we talked about that a little bit already, but just, textbooks cost a lot of money. And whilst we're all moving towards open source resources, if you took the cost of the textbooks that are often traditionally used, you could really reallocate that to include some of the food items that you can access, or the scentscapes that I'll talk about in a bit. So it's kind of a gallery of the senses, right? So for the folks who are on Zoom who won't be smelling anything with us today, I just wanted to put up some things. And for all of you, when we do video, we get a lot of sight and sound, but I find that we're not always building tangible things into our course material. We're not talking, about holding things firsthand, or we're not talking about smell as much as a way to fully be immersed. And so starting with a quick video that I want to show from my fieldwork in trying to get experiences collected that I could then use for multiple things in the future. I spent some time getting to know some folks, and this is one of my friends, Sully, who is going to be sharing a short snippet about his life with us.
Sally from Fiji. I know it's been a while, just been busy with work. And I owe an apology to Miss Miloni Gandhi and to you all for this late video. Informative one for you. So my take on the environment and climate change. So I grew up in two communities.
We won't spend so much time on Sully because we can't hear him, but his story is actually quite amazing. And there's 10 minutes of it, which we weren't going to get through all 10 minutes now anyway. But hopefully we can fix the sound for the next couple of slides. Sully, I actually met because he was working at a hotel. But how many of you, when you go someplace, think that the folks that you're meeting actually have had other lives? I would have never known if I didn't decide I was just going to start chatting with folks. He actually worked for the Ministry of Tourism. He had this amazing wealth of knowledge. He left that job because it was more lucrative to be purely in tourism than working with tourism in the government. And so he was just kind of the perfect person to work on this project with me. And he graciously agreed, even after I left, to keep sending videos that were directly directed to my students so that they would feel like they actually have a vested interest in learning from this person and not just learning through my interpretation of his story. The other thing that I did that I don't know if any of you have ever incorporated, and I actually brought this pair with me in case anyone wants to take a look later. This is a very simple Google Cardboard which turns any of your videos into an immersive experience. It's $15. Yesterday I had a boba drink that cost $7, so it's not too much of a stress. And you just pop your cell phone in right over here and pop them on like any other expensive virtual reality glass that you could get out there, but this one's actually accessible. So one of the videos that I was gonna have my students use through the glass for everyone to see, excuse the sound if it doesn't work. So we'll just do short clips, but you get the idea. When you have the glass, you actually feel like you're going through and you're actually fully immersed, because all of your daily life pings and this, that, and the other thing that are coming at you, when you have these on, you're kind of only right here and you're really feeling that moment. And I'll do a quick tour of a botanical garden. And then to incorporate sound in ways that you don't normally think of. Like when we think of island music, you have one particular kind of sound in your head, you know, that we get fed. But I'm gonna do a short 30 seconds or so of some Fijian pop music sung by our friend Sully. He was a rock star. He also was in his own band. I was super lucky to meet him. And then I'm following it up with some a Seychelles love story. Just enough to get a taste. So I was gonna wait till Millie comes on and does her vocals, but we'll just let you listen to the rest of that on your own. And then I was incorporating scents. So because I was able to remember how things smelled, and you have to take notes when you do this because your own memory will fail you. Then you come back and you try to find things that are maybe not the identical product, but replicate the smell. So I'm going to use Jonas as an example, if I can open my Scentscape. Take smell. What do you smell?
Ooh. Can I smell it again?
Sure.
Can I read the
No,
label?
that's cheating. Don't read.
It smells islandy.
Good one. Thank you. So it actually, if anyone else is curious, I have other Scentscape creation things with me today. I have replicated the botanical garden, and I also replicated a South Asian Fijian kitchen. So there's a couple of things for later. I did not bring you snacks, but these are some of the snacks that I was going to share with my students. You know, COVID's weird, like, do I pass around things openly? Do I wrap them? So you'll notice a lot of things that you might see from other cultures, but, you know, the stories that I wanted to share with my students are how all these different things from different places came to this island and is now what you would get normally across Fiji as Fijian. And of course, again, for later, if you wanted to take a look at some of the local seashells, handicraft traditions, and things like that, I have some for you here to take a look at. And each piece comes with a story from somebody that I met who made these things or collected these things and wanted me to share with all of my students when I told them what I was trying to do. And of course, we'll unpack the adventure as a class and talk about everyone's individual feelings and reactions. And that's just going to be the end because I am now out of time.